Hey, and welcome to the Weed Out, where we weed out the nonsense and talk about the ghouls in our backyard. I'm Spencer Fox Peterson, joined today with my partner as always.
Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Maybuti.
How are you doing today, Joanna?
Pretty good. How are you, Spence?
Pretty good. Really excited to get into today's conversation. We're bringing on one of our favorite local journalists, independent journalists, Andrew Quemere, and
Close.
did I say it wrong? Right.
Quemere.
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 Sorry. We'll edit that. Andrew Quemere, and he's one of our favorite, specializes in records requests. He has a long history of badgering the government for records requests. It's really fun to follow him on Twitter. Uh, and he's doing the Lord's work. So we're happy to have him on the Weed Out. He's definitely an authority compared to us when it comes to local politics. We're very happy to platform him here, and he's going to talk about specifically a story of police brutality. So we're going to get into that, and he'll tell a little bit about the story. But I'm going to do what I normally do and let Joanna take over the questions. So thanks for being on, Andrew, and as always, everybody, please go to our website and check out the links to all Andrew's social media pages and his work on Substack and various other publications. Wherever his name is, we'll make sure you have a link to it. So Joanna, please take it away.
You got it. Thank you so much for being with us, Andrew.
Yeah, of course.
I know that you do a lot of work, like Spence mentioned, in pulling records requests, but this story was particularly interesting to me because I'm from the Berkshires, and I think sometimes like that part of Western Mass is just forgotten by the rest of the state. And I think it's a really interesting story. The title that you have, and I'll refer everyone to this with a link, is She Just Knocked Herself Out, A Tale of Alleged Police Brutality in Berkshire County. And it really is a long, in-depth story. It connects a lot of dots. And I guess I would like to know what drew you to the Berkshires specifically. And I guess you can talk about a little bit what that kind of how did that pique your interest, I guess.
So the way I discovered this story is through something called a Brady list, which for people who aren't familiar with this, it's something that a prosecutor's office, a district attorney's office will keep. And this is not legally required. It's something that some of them do, but not all of them. And what it is, it's a list of police officers who have sort of like a disreputable past, you could say. It's someone who has, either lied in a police report or they've committed some sort of misconduct that is going to call their integrity into question. And the reason a prosecutor would keep this is because legally they're required to tell a defendant in a criminal case if they are aware of evidence that could benefit that person's defense. So if a prosecutor knows that, Officer Smith is going to go in to testify about what he saw, and he knows that Officer Smith, 2 years ago lied in a police report, then he's got to tell the defendant that so that the defendant, when the officer is testifying, can, try to discredit that officer's testimony. And so I have been, last year I was requesting all these Brady lists from different prosecutors throughout the state to find out which ones keep these lists, which ones don't, sort of how they approach these things. And one of the people who did produce a list was Andrea Harrington, the Berkshire County District Attorney, or former district attorney, I should say. I believe that she just left office, was replaced by Timothy Shigrew.
Yes, you're correct on that. That
Yeah,
is correct.
but her office started a Brady list. This was a policy that she enacted about a year and a half after she took office. And so I got this Brady list, and in addition to the list, I had requested the other documents, including the letters that were sent to defense attorneys about the officers on the list. And there were a number of letters related to two officers that caught my eye because they said that the officers had filed reports in that were not consistent with video, and that this incident had been there was a criminal investigation by the state police about alleged excessive force. So when I read that, I was immediately like, okay, there's a video of this, somebody's got to look into it. Like, the first thing I did was like Googled it to see if there was a news story about it because it happened in 2020. And I was like, somebody must have heard about this, but no one had reported on it.
Wow. Okay. That's
And
interesting.
yeah, and what I found was the two officers are actually from different towns that border each other. One is from Egremont and one is from Sheffield, which I'm not from the Berkshires, so I had never heard of these towns before. They're both very tiny. I think Egremont has a population of like 1,300 people. And I was like, okay, that must be why nobody's reported this before, because they're from these two tiny little podunk towns that I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying that, but but they don't have newspapers. Nobody in this town is going to be following up on this. And I was like, I have to look into this because no one else is going to. And so I started requesting records about this, and it took me a long time to get all the stuff that I wanted. I actually got the video fairly early on and the reports from the two officers, but it took me a while to get the a lot of the other documents from like the state police investigation. But anyway, to sort of get into what the actual story is, so there's this video, and it's a little ambiguous, like because of sort of the camera angle, but basically this woman is, let's say she's placed into a police cruiser by these two officers, and she's knocked unconscious. And there's two different accounts. The woman is knocked out for about a minute and a half, and after she wakes up, she almost immediately is talking to the police and says, "You threw me into the vehicle. You're the ones who knocked me out." And meanwhile, while the woman had been knocked out, the one of the officers says, "I'm going to get her medical attention," and the other officer says she knocked herself out. And then that's what both officers ended up writing in their reports, that this woman who was in handcuffs and was being held by these two officers, and I can't remember the woman's weight, it's in the police report, but she was not a very heavy woman. Somehow they're claiming that she was able to overpower two men, and then for some reason threw herself headfirst into the vehicle and knocked herself out. And what the video shows is they're kind of arguing off camera, and the door, this camera is in the back seat of the police cruiser that they're putting this woman in. And what happens is the door opens, and then you see one of the officers holding the woman, and he steps forward and he swings his arm, and then he seems to let go, and the woman goes flying and hits her head. And the other officer is off camera, and he still has his hands on the woman after she goes flying into the vehicle. So it's sort of like hard to definitively say what happened based on the video, but like it's also extremely hard to believe. I mean, this woman, I guess, was, according to the police, was behaving fairly erratically, but it just kind of like defies credulity that someone would like deliberately like slam their head into the inside of a vehicle. And the video like seems to support what she said, that she was thrown into this vehicle. And so the reason we know that this story happened is actually because the police chief of Egremont, Jason LaForest, he talked to these two officers, and he's like, how did this happen? How is this woman knocked out? And he said he was like concerned about what they said. It didn't like make sense to him. So he went and he got the video. This video is actually from the Sheffield Police Department. So he talked to the police chief and got the video. and he watched it, and he told me that he was alarmed by what he saw, and he sort of like hedged on what he told me, but I guess according to the Sheffield Police Chief Eric Munson, he told Eric Munson that he thought that the Sheffield officer, whose name is Jacob Gonska, he's the one who you can see in the video. He said he thought that officer used excessive force, and so he tells the state police, who open an investigation. And in his interview with the state police, he described the video as showing this woman being launched into the police cruiser. And so the other officer, I should say, he's an Egremont officer. His name is Matthew O'Sullivan. And so interestingly, the police chief, he said that this Sheffield officer used excessive force, but he said he didn't think that the Egremont officer did. However, he did tell the state police he thought that the officer filed a false police report. So I guess, again, he's kind of like hedging on a lot of what he said, but it seems to be that he's basically saying that these two officers are trying to cover up that this one particular officer like threw this woman into the vehicle. And he told this to the state police, but the state police said that the video was inconclusive and they didn't seek criminal charges against either officer for excessive force or for the police reports that they wrote. And it's the district attorney's office ultimately though that files charges, and the district attorney's office didn't file any charges, but it did put the officers on the Brady list, as I had mentioned earlier. And then in addition to the criminal investigation, the Sheffield police chief, like I think it was about a week and a half after the incident happened, he wrote like this really cursory report. It's like not even a full page, and it just like describes that like, oh, the woman just like fell into the vehicle and I can't even tell what happened, and it's the officer didn't use excessive force. And then after the criminal investigation starts, he goes to Pittsfield Police Chief Michael Wynn and he says, hey, can you review this? Because Wynn was the part of this like regional law enforcement group that will like come in and investigate things when there's like a conflict of interest or something, I guess, or when they don't have the resources to do it. And this is in Michael Wynn's report. It's really interesting. He said, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to investigate this because I can't like do a complete investigation. But if you want, I'll do an informal use of force review, which that's really weird to say that it's like inappropriate for you to investigate something, but don't worry, I'm going to write this report about it anyway. And so Michael Wynn did not interview any of the witnesses. He didn't do any investigation. He just wrote this like short report, which again said that he couldn't tell what happened in the video. And he like, his description of the video is like that the woman just somehow fell into the vehicle. And so the Sheffield police chief, Eric Munson, did not punish the officer, Jacob Gonska. However, this officer Gonska did apparently voluntarily leave the department as a result of this incident. However, in Egremont, where the police chief actually said that this officer filed a false police report, Jason LaForest, the chief, he didn't open an internal investigation at all, and his explanation was that he was actually there the night this happened, although he didn't witness what happened. But he thought that because he was there, he was like involved in it, and it would be inappropriate for him to investigate. But what that means is that he sort of just like left it hanging, like he didn't call for an outside investigation. I actually talked to Mary Brazzi, who's a member of the Egremont Select Board, and she told me that the police chief didn't inform the select board of the details of what happened that night. And she said she like didn't, she knew that Officer O'Sullivan wound up on this Brady list, but she didn't know why. And when she found out about it, she didn't bother to look into it at all. And she told me that she felt like it wasn't her job. She actually said it's not her job to micromanage the police chief or the personnel director for the town, and that if either one of them thought there was a problem, it was their responsibility to inform the select board. So basically, what happened is these two cops wound up on this Brady list, but neither one of them faced any criminal charges or discipline. And I didn't find this out. This was actually the Berkshire Eagle. I believe the reporter's name is Heather Bello, was following up on my story. And she found that Matthew O'Sullivan, the Egremont officer, actually got a part-time job with the Sheffield Police Department after this incident happened. So I guess the Sheffield police chief felt there was just no problem at all with what happened. So yeah, that's kind of like what
That's like
happened.
it. Yeah, that's like it in a nutshell, I guess. But it's such a long, very, I think, incredibly intertwined story from like what you're talking about in terms of a small town, like podunk towns in the Berkshires. I know exactly what you're talking about, and so does Spence. And they're very tiny towns. But so I'm surprised that a police chief so willingly spoke to you too. And that one chief really gave you a lot of information. I feel like that I don't know if this, like, you'd even maybe necessarily get another chief to give. I've never had a police officer, a chief, let me interview them like on the record, really, other than like a few quotes, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, and what was really interesting about that is he actually offered to speak to me before I even asked to interview him. Like I believe what happened was I sent a public records request to the town, and then he was like, "Hey, if you want to hear about like what happened, call me." And I actually didn't end up calling him until like months later when I had all the records. But he like wanted to speak to me, and I mean, I don't know exactly why we didn't get into this in our conversation, but I think maybe he felt like that, like nobody was paying attention to this and he just needed to like talk to someone about it and get this out there because he had no way of doing it otherwise. But anyway, Spencer is trying to say something.
Oh, I wanted to jump in, and it's interesting. I feel like my initial reaction when you said he reached out to, well, he was eager to speak with you. Let's even just take it like neutral. He was just ready to talk to you. That goes to like my instinct. If he was going to try to put out some propaganda and see how far you'd run with it, you're probably not you're an independent journalist. I don't know if that had anything to do with it. That's my gut instinct, because they're always trying to find a way to best look good without actually having. It's about perception more than anything. Perception matters the most. But I also wanted to share an anecdote with everybody about the Egremont police. I personally had interactions with their traffic detail. So I don't recall the officer at the time, but they are very how to say this diplomatically, hard-headed. I was actually working, and he accused me of speeding, and it would have just been, it was maybe I was like pushing the speed limit, but I wasn't going over the speed limit because of the type of vehicle I was in. I'm very conscious. And what he was accusing me of, from where he was standing and saw me going that speed from around a curve, basically none of it, his story didn't add up like by physics. And I brought that to the magistrate, and he actually got angry at the magistrate and me in the hearing. And the magistrate ended up meeting us in the middle and like dropped my fine down to the minimum. But he was able to tell the magistrate, like, this guy was kind of curt with me. And it's like, what does that mean? You know, so I can see them fudging their police reports is what I'm saying, because they were willing to do that over a speeding violation when I pointed out to them. Yeah, I probably shouldn't have said anything to the officer, to be honest with you. I usually don't talk to cops, but I basically was like, that's physically impossible. I would have flipped the vehicle. Like, if you're
Yeah, well, it's interesting you bring that up because the Egremont officer, Matthew O'Sullivan, uh,
I don't
he's had last when Heather Bello, the Berkshire Eagle reporter, followed up on it, I got some complaints about Matthew O'Sullivan, but she got a bunch more that they hadn't released to me when I did my records request. And this reporting came out in December. Matthew O'Sullivan had 11 complaints. That's when he was hired in 2019. 11 complaints in this tiny town of 1,300 people, which is like, it's insane. Like, that's a lot of complaints.
Yeah, that's very high. That's so high.
And like, there's no sort of like specific average number of complaints, but like something people should be aware of is that like most cops go through their like entire careers only getting, like, in some cases no complaints, but usually like maybe one or two. Like, it's not normal for a cop to have a whole bunch of complaints, particularly like if they're working in like such a like small area where there's like barely any people to complain against them in the first place. And one of the things that came up multiple times in the complaints was like very aggressive traffic stops. Like, he was accused of using like excessive force on a guy who he arrested for disorderly conduct after stopping him. He There was one woman who, she was a bartender, and she said that he followed her home from work and stopped her while she's driving home, and then did like a DUI investigation, like the whole like rigmarole where they're having you like walk on the line. And she was telling him that she's like having a panic attack. And she said that he basically like insisted that she continue doing this field sobriety test while she was like freaking out. And he said that she like failed this test, but then when he does a breathalyzer on her, it's a 0. So like, it sounds like what happened was this guy was just like really overbearing and intimidating towards this like woman who he stopped for seemingly no reason. I think he said that she had crossed over the double yellow line, except there's no camera in his car. So like, who knows? That's something that you can just make up. I mean, even if,
absolutely,
and even if someone does cross over the double yellow line, like, people do that all the time. Like, they're avoiding a pothole, or they're, like avoiding something on the side of the road. Like, it doesn't mean they're like driving dangerously. But he stops this woman, has her pulled over for all this time. She's like really like worried and freaking out, and then she blows a 0 on the breathalyzer. She didn't do anything wrong. And have been other people who complain about like really aggressive traffic stops by this officer. And like, I think this happens a lot in small towns where they have these police departments, and there isn't like a lot of like, actual crime. And they sort of like, instead of like looking for crime, they just go out and are like pulling people over so they can give them lots of tickets and raise money for the town and that kind of thing. I mean, it's like, that's what happened in like Ferguson, Missouri, is that like the police department just like used people who live in the town or who drive through the town to get to work as like a piggy bank. Like, they'll just pull you over, give you a ticket, and then you're getting all these court costs tacked on. And like, I think that happens a lot in small towns. And it's possible that that sort of thing is happening in Egremont or other small towns out in the Berkshires.
absolutely. I know that here in Montague, we did like a police advisory committee over our police, and it gave us no power, but we could pull some data. And we're 8,000 people, so it reminds me of home sometimes. And we have a select board. But my question, because you mentioned the select board, and I have one here, so
Actually, could I just say one more thing before we move on?
Sure.
Which is that, so this officer, Matthew O'Sullivan, would not speak to me when I tried to interview him for my story. And his justification, which I know you want to talk about this later in a different context, but what his justification was, he said, I'm not the media relation, you know, I'm not the spokesperson for this police department, and I don't feel comfortable talking with you without, he said, a written directive from the police chief. And so I asked the police chief, can he talk to me? And the police chief said, sure. And then he said, well, I'm not going to talk to you without a written directive, meaning the police chief has to like order me as part of my job to speak with you. And then after my story came out, the Berkshire Eagle reporter called him up and he spoke with her, even though he's still not the media relations officer for the department. And I did follow up with him and said, hey, it looks like you changed your mind. Would you like to speak with me now? And I never heard back from him. But anyway, what he told her was the reason I get so many complaints is because I'm a proactive officer and I'm out there and I'm more active and I have more interactions with the public, which means there are more opportunities for people to complain against me. And I mean, this
That's
is like a standard
step
this is
pro.
like a standard excuse. It's like you
Yeah.
explain the complaints away by saying, well, everybody gets complaints. So if I have more complaints, it just means I'm doing my job more than other people. And it's sort of like, it's kind of like an amazing thing to say because it's like, first of all, are you saying that your colleagues are not out there like being proactive and doing their jobs? Like you're like a better than everybody and that's why you get more complaints because you're like a better cop? That's why people are saying that you're like this overbearing, aggressive, like violent person because you're better at policing than other cops in your department? And also, what I found really interesting, there was another complaint where he had used force on someone and there was a complaint and the police chief ultimately said he didn't have a problem with the amount of force, but he said that this officer, Matthew O'Sullivan, wrote his original police report so vaguely that he couldn't even like tell what had happened. Like the report, I guess, said like that the officer used a distraction technique because the person was resisting, and it didn't say how the person was resisting. It didn't say what technique he had used. And when the police chief, Jason LaForest, said like, why did you write such a vague report? He said, last time, you know, I wrote a report like this, there was a video and I wound up on the Brady list because I filed an allegedly false police report. And the chief was like, that's like totally unacceptable. You have to like explain what you did. Like that's the policy. And uh, so I mean, that on its own is interesting, but then what makes it more interesting is when this police officer is talking to the reporter for the Berkshire Eagle, he said he's been pushing to get dashboard cameras and body cameras for the Egremont Police Department because he thinks that the videos are going to exonerate him when people complain against him. And like the video is, by his own words, is what got him on the Brady list, and he's like worried about if he writes a police report that it's going to get him in trouble. And not only that, but I think we're going to get to this later. There's another video which I think we're going to have to talk about involving this officer. But anyway, you had a question. Let's get into that.
And it's a question where I think like because some people may not know like the structures of like a select board, and you mentioned that the select board in was it Egremont or Sheffield? Egremont.
Egremont.
So like I ran for select board here, so I know that actually I would have been the boss of the police chief in my town with two other people. So if I were a select board member and I saw those names or I got all of these complaints from my town members, because like you said, like if people start complaining in a small town like that, like there's usually a actual issue because it's, you know, it's not easy reaching out to your town and then everybody knows your everybody knows your name, like everybody knows you're the one complaining. So I don't think people usually like want to just randomly complain about a cop that's harassing them or bothering them and pulling them over. But I do think, like, I don't understand why a select board member would feel like they don't have the responsibility of kind of like overseeing what's happening at the police station. To me, that is kind of shocking. And so I guess that's more of just a clarifying statement so that the audience knows that typically the select board is almost like a mayor, so they would have input for like what happens at the police department, at least as how I understand it.
Well, I think so. In Massachusetts, towns and cities have charters that sort of define how the municipal government functions, like who has certain authority. I don't know if it's standard for the select board to have the hiring and firing power, but apparently in Egremont at least, the select board, this is, I believe, both the police chief and Mary Brazzi, the select woman who I spoke with, both told me that the select board has the ultimate authority in Egremont for hiring and firing. It sounds like they outsource a lot of it to, they have a personnel director, and I assume probably the police chief, for in the police department, for instance, is involved in the hiring process. And I just want to clarify that Jason LaForest, the police chief I spoke with, he was not the police chief at the time that Matthew O'Sullivan was hired. There was a different police chief who left, I believe later that year, 2019, and that's when LaForest took over. So LaForest was not involved in the hiring process, but Mary Brazzi was on the select board at the time that this officer was hired, which actually maybe we could segue into that video that I had just mentioned, because when Officer O'Sullivan was hired by Egremont, he had resigned from a previous job as a reserve police officer in Shirley, Massachusetts, which is in Middlesex County. He had been working as like a reserve officer, which is like you're not like a full police officer. I think it's like, I don't know exactly how they use them in every town, but I think like they use you kind of when there's like staffing shortages that they need to fill in and things like that, or when they need like part-time officers. But he'd worked in Littleton and Shirley, which are both in Middlesex County. But in Shirley, he had to resign after the police chief found cause to fire him. And the reason the police chief wanted to fire him is because of another video that I had mentioned earlier, where he had arrested this guy for alleged drunk driving, and he brings him back to the police station. And I guess the guy was like being, not very cooperative and was like arguing with him. And there was another reserve officer named Ian Brown who was there. And according to his report, like it was this guy who was arrested and Matthew O'Sullivan were kind of like riling each other up, like, saying things to each other and getting on each other's nerves. And he kind of had like O'Sullivan leave the room so he could handle things, but O'Sullivan was like coming back to like get like his like stuff or to like ask a question or something, and they would continue to like make comments and egg each other on. But eventually they decide to bring this guy to a holding cell, and both Officer Brown and O'Sullivan are bringing this guy to the holding cell, and he's like not being very cooperative, and he grabs the door to try to prevent himself from being put into the cell. This part is actually on video. You can't see them when they're leading him in the hallway, but you can see when they're at the door to the cell. And so this guy is like resisting being placed in the cell, and they kind of eventually they push him in, and then the guy is like standing in the doorway, like just not in the doorway, he's like standing in the cell, and O'Sullivan is in the doorway, and he like suddenly kicks the guy in the groin, and then he puts his fists up like, he wants to like start like a fist fight with this guy. And the other Officer Brown, has to push Officer O'Sullivan out of the doorway and close the door. And like they were talking after, you can hear the audio, and O'Sullivan is like, why'd you push me back? And the guy is like, he says like, why'd you push me back? Like that guy like started it. And he's like, you were like trying to start a fight with him, like, you. And so the department had a supervisor investigate this incident and said that like it was an inappropriate use of force, and the police chief said, yeah, like we need to fire this guy. And 5 days later, he resigns. This is in 2017. And then 2 years later, he gets a job with the Egremont Police Department. And, then this other stuff happens where he's getting all these complaints, and he's subject of a criminal investigation, and he winds up on a Brady list. And what I found so I talked to Mary Brazzi about this because like she was one of the people who was responsible for vetting this guy, and she told me she knew sort of vaguely that there was some issue with the Shirley Police Department, but she didn't know what it was. She said that she didn't like review the internal affairs records at the time that the town hired him. She said that she didn't even know if the town had a policy of like requesting the records from the employers to review them. And I also spoke with the police chief of Shirley, who's the same police chief at the time that
Oh,
this had happened. And he told me that if a new potential employer reaches out to them, they put a document in the person's personnel records to show that they've been contacted. So he said that if Egremont had reached out to them for a copy of the records, there would be like a record of that in their personnel records. And he said there wasn't. So there's no. It appears that Egremont just like they knew that this guy worked for Shirley because they actually, when they hired him, the police chief made a Facebook post that was like, this is Matthew O'Sullivan and he has experience working as a police officer in Eastern Massachusetts. But they didn't reach out to the departments to find out like what his record was. And if they had, they would have found out that, he had to resign from his job because of this other incident. And um, like when I asked Mary Brazzi, like, why did you hire him when this other town um like found cause to fire him? She said, this is like a verbatim quote. She said, that's an interesting question. And like, yeah, it is, but it's a question that she should be answering. And so she said like she would look into this. And I was like, okay, well, like when you're done looking into it, can you get back to me and like tell me what happened? And she said, I think her words were, I'm not inclined to do that. And I was like, okay, why? And she was like, well, it sounds like you've already looked into this and know what happened. And I'm like, no, I know what happened with the incidents, but like I want to know like what your response is to it, like. And she's like, well, you'll have to like call me back or something to that effect. So I called her back the next day. Um, and I believe I wasn't even trying to talk to her. I was trying to get in touch with the other select board members because I wanted to get their reactions too. But
yeah.
she told me that none of them were going to talk to me anymore because their lawyer had told them not to speak with me. And to be honest, I was surprised that she spoke with me at all
Yeah.
in the first place. I think maybe I sort of caught her a little off guard, but
Yeah,
she did
probably.
she spoke to me in like a recorded conversation for like 15 or 20 minutes or something, and she told me all this stuff about how like it wasn't her job to micromanage the police chief, etc. And yeah, like you said, you were shocked by that. I like when I was like just listening to her on the phone, I was like, did she really just say that? Like, I can't believe that she's like just admitting that she's like passing the buck here. But
Yeah.
yeah,
It's giving the game away that the police chief or the police union or the police institution runs the town. Like we always joke around about Holyoke, and it's like you can't pass a budget without getting the chief's sign off because he's actually more powerful than the mayor or the council. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, it's
crazy.
interesting you say that because that's the dynamic in a lot of places. But I sort of like, if I had infinite time, this is like so like bizarre to me that I like almost wish I could like move to Egremont and just like bug everybody forever until I could find out more about this. But like it seems like maybe that's not how Egremont functions because like the police chief was like concerned about this enough that he is like saying like I want to talk to you like before I even ask for an interview. He wants to talk to me about this. And he uh like maybe he doesn't have all the power in this town. Like he kind of stopped talking to me eventually, so there's only so much information I could get out of him. And like obviously the people who run the town aren't going to talk to me anymore.
Yeah.
But
Well,
like, no, but so like, no, hold on, let me just finish this point, which is that like, I don't know that the police chief always does have all the power. A lot of the time, like police, the individual officer, it's almost like, you know, in like the sort of like civics textbook version of, you know, like America, like the police are public servants who serve the public trust and the public good. But like in reality, there's sort of like this like separate entity that is like above the rest of society. Like they almost like function independently, and they have like power that is like unchecked by any other institution. And like one example of this is like in Egremont specifically, one of those 11 complaints I mentioned was Officer O'Sullivan had violated the town's, according to the police chief, violated the town's or policy about like motor vehicle chases. And uh, it was like a nighttime. It was like snowing, and I guess he was driving, according to the report, like this was like a chase that was like 20 miles over the speed limit because someone had like expired tags, I think was what started it. And the car ends up crashing, and the police chief said that the officer had made like statements that contradicted what the like radio traffic had showed, and he violated the like chase policy. Like he should have just like let the vehicle alone and like, you know, um and not started this like dangerous chase that resulted in a crash. And all he punished the officer with was a 3-day suspension. But then like that's not where it ends. What happens is the officer goes to an arbiter and says that's unfair, and then the arbiter, who's like this guy who, I don't have the documents, but I assume that they have like some sort of contract with the police union to like appeal things to an arbiter. This is something that often happens in these police contracts, where if you punish an officer, they can have this arbiter, not like a court, not a judge, just like some private person who they hire, who will like review it. And they often will reverse what the police do, police chiefs say. Like in Boston, there's one guy who's I think been fired twice, and both times like an arbiter said you have to rehire him. It was like I think both of them were for police brutality incidents. But in Egremont, this guy, Officer O'Sullivan, gets a 3-day suspension, and the arbiter is like, no, that's unfair, you get a 1-day suspension. So even like for these like the tiniest punishment you can imagine, they have like this unbelievable recourse. Like, can you imagine like like a employee at Walmart being like, you can't fire me. Like, I'm gonna go have this private guy like tell you that you can't fire me. Like, it's like it's like kind of unbelievable, because it's like the police almost like not even the like police chief, but the police themselves almost like run the show, you know, like it's like they're above beyond reproach. Like you can't even like hold them accountable at that point.
Well, yeah, like the one of the arguments, this is a little off topic but similar, what's going on in Greenfield currently with their chief. He basically the gist I got from him, we'll talk about this on a later date, but like the gist I was getting is he was concerned about the union and how the union's going to respond. And it's like, because he's the management technically, right? But he's like, even though he's the management, it's like, are you on the union side here? You're like, that was like he was trying to argue. I don't know. It's just crazy. You're right. Like how much power and recourse they have. You know, we've successfully demonized the teachers union, but you know, meanwhile, the police union is actually doing all the awful shit a union can do.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess like a
Yeah.
police union is like a really um it's an interesting subject, you could say. Like they like a normal union is like, hey, we want better wages and better working conditions, and like that's part of what police unions do. But the other thing they do is like, hey, you shouldn't be allowed to fire us when we beat the shit out of somebody, you know? Like it's not like it's not like just advocating for it's not like just advocating for their rights, it's like advocating for their ability to harm other people. And like it's just like I think that like people can't think of a police union in the same way you think of like a normal union. Like it's not really the same. Like it might be one thing to say that we deserve to be paid X amount or something, but like to sort of bargain over like the accountability measures, like when you are a person who walks around with a gun and can like shoot people and beat people and put them in a cage, it's like not really the same thing. It's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, it's not just collective bargaining, it's like protection, like you said, to like harm people.
And they'll break up. They don't have any solidarity with any other union. You know, like the funny joke is like the fire department don't even fuck with them. Like you'd think they'd be on the same side, but like their unions historically have not gotten along.
No, I mean, police are often the people who show up to help break up strikes or to give people a hard time or whatever.
And oh,
So well, actually, one other thing I was curious. I don't know. I don't have any information on this, but that Officer O'Sullivan, he sounds like the poster child for the STEP program. I don't know if you're familiar with the STEP program.
What's that?
It's called Selective Traffic and Horse and Enforcement. Selective Traffic Enforcement Program, and basically it's like a federal grant program. I'm guessing. I'm just gonna paraphrase real quick because it's not the point of the episode, but basically what he's arguing, because it incentivizes communication or interactions, I guess, and that's what they call it. So pulling you over to interact with you, it's like this guy's like, well, I'm interacting with a lot of people, I'm doing my job, you know. And that's exactly what the STEP program sort of is. And so when cops say they don't have a quota, like a ticket quota, they do, though, because if they're getting any money from the STEP grant, they have to show that they're like having interactions, and you got to justify your interactions. So
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of an interesting point. I don't know what grants like Egremont or Sheffield specifically get, but just like to go back to my point about how police are sort of like on their own level, like the federal grants are kind of one aspect of that, because it's like you can cut the police budget and say we don't want you to do all this like as much like drug enforcement anymore, so we're going to cut funding for your SWAT team or whatever. But then they'll just go to the federal government and they'll get a grant to fund their SWAT team and do it anyway. Like there's all these grants for like, you know, there's like the famous one is, or infamous I should say, is like the 1033 program where they get like military gear. But there's like, I believe there's something called the Burn program where they get like funding for like drug policing. There's, you know, traffic grants, like you say. And I think that like, you know, police are supposed to be like subject to democratic control, but to a large extent they're not, because like the federal government is not very responsive to like what, you know, people want. Local communities often are the same way, but there's more of a chance for people to make an impact there. But if the police can just go to the federal government and say we're going to like use all these grant programs to do whatever we want, even if the local community thinks, you know, we shouldn't be pulling as many people over, we shouldn't be doing drug policing, we should be, you know, like scaling back, and we should only be investigating serious crimes, the police can just be like, well, you know, we're going to get grants and do whatever we want. And I think that's like one aspect of it.
I mean, there's sheriffs in Illinois saying they're not going to enforce the new law, and that law is probably going to get struck down. That assault rifle ban, I'm guessing, it's going to get struck down. But
yeah, and there's
just like, we're not going to enforce that law. It's like, wait, what?
I think
you don't get that.
I think I'm going to double check this. I think it was Pittsburgh, where the town, or I'm sorry, the city. Yeah, okay, this is Pittsburgh. The city passed like an ordinance that's like, we don't want you to pull people over for like minor traffic infractions because we're trying to reduce the number of traffic stops so that they won't result in like, you know, harming people, like violent encounters with the police. And the police chief said that they're just going to pull people over anyway because not being able to pull people over for these minor infractions was hurting officer morale. So he's like saying that the police are going to be real sad if they're not allowed to harass people for minor traffic infractions. And so they're so sad about it that they're just going to break the law and do it anyway, even though they're not allowed to. And like that's kind of, I think, how a lot of police see themselves, is we're just like, we are this separate entity, we're separate from the other parts of the government. Like there are no checks and balances that can prevent us from doing what we want, because we just deserve the sort of latitude to like act on our own discretion, without any restraint.
And this article just shows that to like down, in my opinion, so well, Andrew, because it's like there's this chief in a small town and he's willing to like admit that something might be going on. He's willing to talk to you. He's referring it to Pittsfield. And like, I guess I almost would like you to run. I was hoping you could like maybe run us, because there's so many checks involved, like the state police and the Pittsfield Chief of Police. So like this is just another example, I guess, and I guess you can talk more on this, like how even when they're trying, like the small town police officer was trying in some way to have some sort of checks and balances, they're holding each other accountable. So like the people at the higher levels were just basically like, oh, I found, and like you said at the beginning, like Chief Wynn even said like he wrote a report, he couldn't fully investigate it.
Yeah, I mean that's part of it. Took me a long time to write this, and part of it was because of the number of like agencies involved, and just to sort of show like all of these people were involved in this, and the sort of extent of what happened was these two guys wind up on a list that, just to be clear, this Brady list I mentioned, it doesn't stop them from testifying in court. It doesn't really punish them in any way. It just means that defendants will have to be informed that the officers engaged in this conduct. So that this was not a punishment in any way. So just that was the only sort of outcome of this. But the number of people who looked into this, there's the Egremont Police Department, the Sheffield Police Department, there's the Massachusetts State Police, there's the Berkshire County District Attorney's Office.
Oh yeah, okay.
There's the Pittsfield Police Chief. And then another weird thing about the Pittsfield Police Chief's report, which I didn't put in the article because it was so long, but he said he was going to have one of his officers also look into it, like separately from him, and then they were going to like compare their conclusions afterward. And she did not write a report though, and there's nothing in his report about what she found. And I found this very like bizarre that he would say that he's going to have this other person look into it. And I tried to talk to both that officer and the police chief. The officer didn't respond to me, and the police chief had his like assistant talk to me, and she initially said that, oh, this has nothing to do with the Pittsfield Police Department. It's the Egremont and Sheffield Police Departments. Go talk to them. And I was like, I literally sent her a copy of the report with his signature at the bottom, and was like, he wrote this report. Like, that's what I want to talk to him about. You saying, like that he didn't do this. And she was just like, we have no comment, like, so I don't really know, like, and like the other thing is that when I filed a records request with all these people, and the Pittsfield Police Department, the chief said that he reviewed all of these records, like the video and stuff, and they didn't give me any of those records, even though I asked for them. So like, either they're not following my records request, or the chief like didn't actually review these records. Like it's so and then like the other thing is I want to talk a little bit more about the state police investigation, because
Absolutely.
to show how thorough this investigation was, they did not talk to Matthew O'Sullivan, and they have reports showing like their efforts to talk to people. So like, if he like refused to talk to them, there should be a report about that, right? Like,
right.
but there's absolutely nothing. Like, we called Matthew O'Sullivan, we called his lawyer, we sent him an email, nothing. They didn't, as far as I can tell, did not reach out to him, and the state police wouldn't talk to me, so I couldn't get any additional information from them beyond what was in the reports. And then they recorded these conversations with the witnesses they did interview, but I don't have the recordings. I just have these reports that summarize what happened. So like, that's how I know some of what the Chief LaForest told the state police. However, Jacob Gonska, the Sheffield police officer, he did talk to the state police, and they did record his conversation, but there's no report. So I have no idea like what he told them, like how he justified what happened, how he explained it. I do have his like original report that he wrote for the Sheffield Police Department, but I don't know what he told the state police. So like, we don't really even understand why the state police or the district attorney's office reached this conclusion that there, no criminal charges need to be filed. Like, it's just the investigation was so like shallow, and they didn't even bother to document everything that they did. Like, and I would sort of question whether that is like standard protocol, or if it's only something that happens when, you're investigating your colleagues in another police department.
30%
But
of tax dollars at work, everybody. 30%.
yeah,
and so like I did not see the article that Heather Bellows you mentioned
mhm.
wrote. So I wonder like, where is this? I know that I would call her a victim that of what may have occurred. It seems like from the video, like she was assaulted. I would hope she's okay. I know her name hadn't been released at the end of your article, and I wonder like, where is that now? Did they drop that? Is there any more information about that, or is it kind of just everyone's moved on?
So just to clarify one thing, I do know who the woman is. I know her name. And I have her phone number, in fact, because the police didn't redact it from one of the reports they gave me. I have reached out to her, did not hear back. I also reached out to her attorney, did not hear back from her either. And also, I just want to clarify that the reason I didn't release her name is because, this whole thing started with this sort of like domestic violence incident, and she was arrested for allegedly assaulting someone. However, she also alleged that she was assaulted, not by the person. It's a little confusing. She's not accusing. So she's accused of assaulting this man, and she accused a different man of assaulting her. So she is allegedly the victim of domestic violence, and I felt it would be inappropriate to release her name. However, I did reach out to her, didn't hear back from her, and I have no idea what happened. I mean, I know that she did go to the hospital after this happened, and the doctor said she had head trauma and her neck was strained, probably from what happened, one would assume. So I don't know. I mean, like, head trauma is no joke. Like, you can, like, I don't know like what happened to her, but like, if you hit your head, like, it's bad news. Like, you don't want to do that, and to hit your head so hard that you're knocked unconscious, like, that is, it's not great. Like, not a great thing to happen. Like, it can cause permanent damage just from one head injury if it's bad enough, and even if it's not bad enough to like screw you up, like, head injuries can accumulate over time. I mean, everybody knows that now from like all the stuff with like football players and soccer players and stuff. But that's why like police are trained to not strike people in the head. I mean, they of course still often do it, but you're not supposed to hit someone in the head. Like, if you hit someone like, with your fists, or kick them, or, hit them with a baton or whatever, you're supposed to aim for other areas because of how dangerous it is to hit someone in the head. But, that's what happened to her in this incident. She like slammed her head so hard that she was just like completely knocked out. And like you can, if people watch this video, they will see the officers like lift her up after she's unconscious, and her body is completely limp. Like she just like she's her head is not supported, and it like sags down, and you can just tell that she is unconscious. Like so she hit her head pretty hard, I guess.
Yeah, and that's why I followed up there because I hope that she's okay out there. And I also wondered if it just had to be one of those cases like so many others where it kind of does just end up nothing happens to maybe they get 1 day suspension or something like that. But I agree with you. It's scary that that can happen because, like you said, head trauma overall. Like even if she did have something, even if she was resisting, the police should not be giving us head trauma. So I think I just was hoping that there was some potentially more information with like a good outcome. But I think it's amazing to bring this to light because again, the Berkshires are like considered America's premier cultural resort. That's actually the slogan of the area. And you know, there's a large portion of people that are not wealthy and it's has a lot of poverty, in fact, and people that small towns and different police stations with many different styles. And you don't always, I think, like this story, like you don't always know what's going on in small towns, I think. And this really highlights um, how something really tragic can happen in a small town. And then even if you try to go out and get help or kind of rectify it, it's not necessarily going to happen. I am glad that the Brady list exists, and I do hope that like more DAs and people hiring use those. I didn't know much about those until I read your article and looked into that more. So that was very interesting to find out
Yeah,
about.
and just to clarify for people, those do not exist in every part of the state. Like, for example, the Worcester County doesn't have one. This is something that even though prosecutors should be doing it, not all of them do. And like when they don't do it, it really raises like a serious question. They're not obligated to keep the list, but they are obligated to tell people when there's misconduct by the police that could affect their integrity, you know. And for them to they work like the police might not work for the DA as like their employees, but they work with the DA every day. Like that's how criminal cases are brought. Like the police will say, "Hey, we arrested, you know, so and so for, you know, whatever," and then the DA will look it over and bring charges. And if the DA, you know, is working with these people on a daily basis, but doesn't have a method for tracking which people there are concerns about, it just like really raises the question: are they actually turning over this information to people when they're supposed to? And like I don't want to get into it too much because it's kind of off topic, but like the Worcester Police Department is currently under federal investigation for a pattern and or practice of excessive force, racial discrimination, and they call it gender biased policing, which it sounds like they're being accused of like raping sex workers basically or sexually assaulting them. Um, but yeah, the Worcester County DA doesn't keep a Brady list, and I think this is sort of one of the factors. The Department of Justice doesn't tell the public like why they start these investigations, and there's like a million things, which again is why I don't want to get into too much detail. But I think sort of like the failure of a DA to provide any oversight to the police is like probably one of the factors that, you know, played a role in this case. And so uh, Andrea Harrington has a lot of faults, or had, I guess we could say. She's not the DA anymore, but at least she started this policy of a Brady list. And I think that all the DAs need to do this, and that I really think, you know, my own personal opinion is that we need a state law that says you need a Brady list. And that's something that New Hampshire passed, I think, last year. Within the last couple of years, a law that there's like a statewide Brady list. And I think that's a great idea that every state should implement.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I know you even mentioned in your article that like there are like WBUR covered like a dozen different police kind of like moving around
Oh
throughout
yeah,
the
I can't,
state.
can't believe I didn't mention that earlier.
So
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could talk about that a little, because I know we mentioned like this officer Sullivan came from Shirley to Egremont. There's a lot of towns here. So,
Yes.
but then I'm seeing this other article that you shared, and I just think I would agree and completely hope that thank you, Andrew Harrington, and I hope DA Shagru follows through in the same way, because that is such a good resource. And why wouldn't you want to be at least within, like, at least trying to do good in your community, by your community? So that was shocking to me, though. That was at least a dozen police officers reported you had put in there. So
Yeah,
if
well,
you
just really quick, the excuse that they give typically for not having these Brady lists, or this is the one the Worcester DA used anyway, is that it would be unfair to the police officers and it would violate their due process rights by putting them on this list with like no due process, which is like an incredible thing to say, because the whole point of the list is that the people who are actually being charged with crimes are the ones who have the right to due process. And part of that right is having the evidence turned over to them. And he's like flipping that on its head and saying that, oh, it would be violating the officer's due process rights to protect the due process rights of the people who actually have the due process rights here, which is like an incredible thing to say. But yeah, so around the time I was working on this story about the Egremont Sheffield thing, WBUR ran this story where they found 12 officers, they said more than 12, I believe, who they were either resigned or fired after findings of misconduct and then got jobs with other police departments in the state. And they didn't release all the names. I think they only reported on like two of the cases, which were involved allegations of sexual assault and drunk driving. Um, since they didn't release the names, I reached out to WBOR to find out if Matthew O'Sullivan was one of these officers, and they said he was not. So that's another officer in addition to that, a dozen plus. And I think what was your question was like, how often does this happen? Is
Well,
that what you
yeah,
said?
is there a way to know? Because I guess not, because they may not give us the names
So,
or keep track.
well, let's say not yet, but let me expand on that in a second. So I guess actually my first sort of reaction to that question is like, I don't think many police officers like need to get new jobs after they do misconduct, because like the chances of them being fired are so slim. Like they, first of all, their police departments often back up officers who do like clear misconduct. Like they won't fire someone even though they're like caught on video, like unambiguously like using
Right.
excessive force and lying on a police department, lying on a police report. They'll just be like, oh well, they followed policy, so we're not going to do anything. Or they will have extremely minor consequences, like, you know, a 1 day suspension or something. um, let's say the officer does get fired, they often have civil service protections, and they probably also have union contracts that
Right.
stipulate different sort of due process uh, mechanisms for the accountability. So like if an officer gets fired, he might be able to contest that, like appeal it or something. And in my opinion, I think that like this goes back to what I was saying about like how the police are almost like a separate entity with like more power, you know, they act independently, is that like a lot of times I think this is something that sometimes I think this is used as an excuse for not taking action, but I think it has a certain merit too. Like police chiefs will say, I didn't fire this guy because I thought that the arbiter was just going to overturn the firing, and I'd have to not only bring him back, but I'd have to pay him like back pay for all the time that he was sitting on his butt at home, you know, contesting the firing. Um, and so in some cases, they won't fire them because of these protections that normal people don't have for their jobs. In other cases, they'll fire them, but they'll get their job back. Um, and when they do get fired, it's not really possible to know how this how often this happens, because there's no. So up until recently, Massachusetts is like one of the few states that does not have a certification system for police. So like if you want to be a hairdresser in Massachusetts, you need more training than a police officer, and you need to get like a cosmetology like professional license, um, to cut people's hair or to dye their hair or whatever in like a professional setting.
Too. Like
What?
it's like then you
Say that
also
again?
you have to get licensing from the town as
Yeah, I
well.
mean,
Like
you have
you
to. There's
gotta be
lots of professional.
a bureaucrat.
Yeah, and I mean, there's lots of professional licensing, and a lot of it is for a good reason. Like, you want your doctor to have gone to medical school. You want your
Yeah.
lawyer to, you want your lawyer to have, studied up on the area of law he's practicing or she's practicing. Um, you want, other professional people to know what they're doing. Um, but for some reason, people who get to carry a gun and lock people in cages and, take away their freedom, those people, at least in Massachusetts, did not need any sort of professional licensing. They just get training from like other police officers for, like I said, less training often, in many cases, than the people who are cutting your hair. Um, and I don't know how much additional training they're getting now as a result of this, but they do have to get a license now from. It's a result of in 2020, as you may have heard, there were a lot of protests about police for some reason. You know, uh, because people, I guess, didn't want, to be murdered by the police anymore. So Massachusetts passed the police reform law in 2020, which was watered down in some respects because of Governor Baker opposing certain elements of it, which was like a really cowardly move by the legislature because they could have just, overrode his veto, but they didn't. Uh, and they passed this police reform law. It creates the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, which is basically it's the certification body for police. It creates all the standards that for policing that like are statewide standards, because uh, police will often set their, the departments, they set their own policies. There's a lot of gray areas where there's no like state law mandating X, Y, and Z for like don't choke people, for instance. Like I think that was one thing that was actually banned in the police reform law.
I would love
Uh,
to see a social media like disclaimer, or like they would have to disclose a disclosure social media accounts. And if they get, because like dude, some of these guys are actually sitting on the side of the road and collecting money as an influencer too while on the clock. Yeah, it's
yeah,
actually like I'm on TikTok. It's like
yeah. Well, I
unfortunately.
mean, don't get me started about the police details. Like it's such a scam. Like
Oh,
it's unbelievable. Like how much of a scam that is.
flag,
Um,
these $110,000 a year flag holders, while sitting in an SUV. It's like
yeah,
running.
they're already making six figures, and it's like, but we need to get overtime by sitting on our butts.
Dude, I think about
Well,
the engines idling 12 hours a day. I drive up and down the pike all day. It's crazy.
yeah,
I just think about that way. So I was like, this is nuts.
yeah. But anyway, so the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, it's the Post Commission for
Yeah.
short, or just Post, some people call it.
I've been seeing this a lot more because I've like a few officers around here were not making the cut. So thank you for bringing this up, Andrew.
Yeah, so the Post Commission is like still sort of like in its rollout, I guess you could say. Like, so um, basically, every officer needs to get certification from this commission. However, while the commission is setting up, every like person who's already working as a police officer is automatically gets certification for a certain amount of time by law. So they don't have to like apply for it. They just get it as a result of being a police officer. And then there's like 3 phases where, depending on the letter your last name starts with, you have to get certified. So like the first group they did is A through H. And those people last year had to get recertified. So they'd have to apply for like certification for the first time. They're like when their initial automatic certification expires. So A through H would include Gonska, Jacob Gonska, the Sheffield police officer. And like I mentioned, he resigned from his job, and they released the names of all the people who were recertified. So I checked to see if he was on there, and he was not. And
Okay.
I don't know why that is. It's possible that he like tried to get a job somewhere else, but like couldn't get certified. But I guess more than likely he probably didn't try. The police chief in Sheffield told me that he had gotten a job outside law enforcement, which doesn't mean that he didn't subsequently get another job in law enforcement, but I didn't find any evidence of that. But the other officer, O'Sullivan, doesn't have to get recertified until later this year. So he's like automatically recertified. I'm sorry, automatically certified, but he needs to get recertified. However, the commission has to like periodically recertify people to make sure they're like still up to the standards. However, they can initiate a process called decertification, which is like you've engaged in serious misconduct and now you can't be a police officer like anymore in Massachusetts. And so far they have not done this at all. And I have there's a lot of officers who haven't been recertified who are part of the initial A through H group. However, it's not clear like why, and in a lot of cases they've released some like numbers, but it's a little vague. But a lot of the people, it's because they're on leave for some reason. It might be medical leave, it might be that they're under investigation, but they're on leave from their job, and they're basically they don't have to file all the paperwork until they get back from their leave. So like they have 90 days to complete the process. So a lot of the people who you're seeing in the news when they say, this many officers were not recertified, it doesn't mean that people are being held accountable. It just in a lot of cases means that like they don't have to get their paperwork in, until later. So and in fact, a lot of people who have been in the news for misconduct or alleged misconduct have been recertified. Like on the Brady list, for example, in Berkshire County, I found 3 people on that list who were recertified by the Post Commission. And there's like other people I found, like a Cambridge police officer who was arrested for like allegedly drunk driving, and I believe he got into a car accident and he's recertified. There was another officer in, I think, Braintree, who he grabbed a woman by her hair and screamed in her face like, I'm going to put you through like a wall or something to that effect. And they the prosecutor there put him on the Brady list, but the police department said his behavior was unacceptable and then promoted him to be a lieutenant. And he got recertified too. And so like this Post Commission, I am really skeptical of it. So they did recently, what they did is they suspended people's certification for the first time, which it gets very confusing because there's like certification, there's recertification, there's denying certification, there's suspending certification, and there's decertification. So there's a lot of like confusing like nuances to it. But the suspending means like we haven't decertified you yet, but you have I believe, I don't know if it was all of them, but I think it was at least most of them were people who had either been like convicted of or were at least like charged with committing crimes. And to me, this shows that like the post commission just hasn't been effective yet. Like that is such a low bar. Like these people are charged with crimes, so you suspend them. Like I just like they've already been charged with crimes. Like what? I mean, like what is the post commission adding here? You know, if they've already been charged with crimes, like suspending their license to be a cop, like it, maybe there are cases where that will prevent them from getting a new job, but in a lot of cases, those people have already like lost their jobs or like they're suspended from their department pending being fired. Um, like what will impress me is when the post commission says, okay, this officer did something bad and his department cleared him and said, oh, don't worry, it was policy, he's following policy when he beat this guy up. And then the post commission comes in and says, no, actually that guy, was not following the standards for policing and we're going to decertify him and he can't be a police officer anymore. And that is when I will sort of be impressed with the post commission because, back to the point about like police sort of being like, like acting on their own and being independent and not having oversight. Like when part of the problem with policing is like so much of it gets left up to these like internal investigations where it's their colleagues who they, walk by every day or they talk to every day, or like, oh, now I have to investigate you. And it's my job as a police officer and a colleague and possibly even like a friend to say that you broke all these policies and deserve to be fired. And
There's
they just
also a culture of violence where there is an inherent threat. I mean, I don't want to accuse anybody in this situation, but like that's in the back of everybody's mind. I mean, they see these people or their personalities or the types, they throw people in cages. Their only solutions are violence.
yeah, I mean, exactly.
So,
like if
they kind of are, they assume everybody else thinks like that too, including their colleagues, because they've seen them do it. So it really is conducive to like everybody keeping their mouth shut. It is like a
yeah,
mafia.
I mean, the problem isn't just that police are like policing themselves and it's like their colleagues who are responsible. It's also the fact that those people are police in the first place because like police think a certain way. Like you can watch a cop like beat the shit out of someone and be like, holy shit, like that is
Yeah.
like a violent assault, that's a crime. And the cops will be like, oh, don't worry about it, that's just what we do. Like, because they think that that's okay because they have cop brain and like they don't think like normal people. Like
Yeah.
Whenever you're a hammer, everything's a goddamn nail. Like that's
yeah,
just the only tool they have is a gun, a stun gun, a billy club, a cage, a car with a cage. Uh, and then they can cage you in pre-detention, and say you were violent with them because you didn't want to go with them. And it's like, well, I mean, who would want to go with you?
yeah,
Well, yeah, exactly. Like this is why this story is like both of what you just said is why this story is so interesting to me as someone who definitely wouldn't want this police officer pulling me over in this small town, because the narrative becomes their own, even if there's evidence, even if there's a video, they could harm me. And like you mentioned in Worcester, they were sexually assaulting sex workers potentially, and it's not even called sexual assault. So like they do have these different, I guess, like entirely different codes of what I wouldn't call them ethics of like addressing and dealing with society that I think most of us would find appalling if we are looking into it. So that's why I've always been interested in record pulling, not like yourself, Andrew, and thank you for all the help you've ever given me. But when I started realizing what was happening with the police myself as an adult, and that you can get involved in your local government and kind of potentially make a complaint or like have some input on the budget when it comes around. That's when I really started getting interested in the records and seeing what was going on. But I think recently I've realized, and you mentioned this too, and I don't know if you have any more insight because I haven't looked into what to do about this, but talked about the police unions, like the how they really have the most power, and that's what I'm seeing recently. Like in many towns, like they can't, do much because it will be a liability for the town against the contracts and stuff like that too. So like if the arbiter decides for one day and you want to do more, you may face like charges and have to pay money out to for violating a contract. So I just personally wonder, like as someone who's totally pro union, other unions do not have that power, and I do think I don't know if there's any way to kind of rein in the power that those associations or unions have. I don't know what you think about that, but it's kind of almost alarming, the amount of
Yeah,
power.
yeah. I mean, I think that the way that you rein in police unions is that you pass laws, because like often police will they'll get contracts that give them these, like protections that normal workers don't have. I think it's important for the law to say those protections can't exist. Like you have these protections that are specified in the law and you can't negotiate over these things. Because I think that like police unions have so much power, because if they will not like negotiate, things will go into arbitration, and then the arbitration will like have to come up with some compromise, and it just like prevents any sort of like I mean, like you can look at what's going on in Boston right now, where they're trying to rein in all this like insane like overtime, where the cops are they're like millionaires. These police are millionaires because they're like standing around, twiddling their thumbs, playing on their phones, like like while they're supposedly directing traffic. And they have these contracts where like if you show up for 15 minutes, you get paid 4 hours of overtime. So cops will like walk paperwork down to the courthouse and then clock out, and they'll get paid like for 4 hours, time and a half. And it's like it's totally insane. And you have people who are making like more than the mayor. And the mayor, Michelle Wu, is trying to rein in a lot of these practices, and she's trying to I think wants to get like civilian flaggers to take over for the police, so that they can, I mean, one, it'll save money, and two, it will cut down on like the police overtime. And in theory, you think that the police would, and the police claim their goal is to protect people from crime. So you would think that what they want to do is go investigate crimes, not like direct traffic. But no, they'd rather direct traffic, because it's awesome to have a job where you don't have to do anything and you get paid a shitload of money. Because like that's what they really care about, is the money, not the public safety. And like one of their arguments has been that, oh, if there's like a crime near where we're directing traffic, we'll be able to respond very quickly. And I think one of they said this at like a city council meeting. I can't remember who asked this, but one of the city councilors was like, well, if you have to leave to go like address a crime, you like can't direct traffic anymore, right? And they're like, yeah, we can't do both at the same time, and the crime would be our priority. So it's like it doesn't even make sense from like a public safety perspective to have the cops directing traffic, because like if there's a crime, they have to leave, and like now nobody's directing traffic. And I think there's been problems where like there aren't enough cops to direct traffic, so like there's like projects that can't be done. It like stifles the development for the city. Like it's so crazy, and it's all just because these cops want to line their pockets. And but like it all comes down to like these negotiations with the union. Like Michelle Wu is trying to actually get concessions from the police and rein in the overtime spending, but they are being so resistant, to the point where I haven't been following it super closely, but the last thing I heard was that they were like the negotiations had kind of like stalled, and they might end up going to some sort of like arbitration or something. But like the cops never want to give up their overtime. They never want to give up their like paid details. They just they want lots of money. And I mean, you can't really blame them, but like it's not like a good result for everyone else.
Yeah, and it's not feasible for society because like you said, like they're supposed technically they are supposed to protect us. And I know that's what we're told, but I know there are Supreme Court and other court they're actually supposed to protect property, and like what what they show by assaulting us, especially in this article that you have written about this poor woman who, even though you're involved in a domestic violence dispute, doesn't mean that when someone gets there, they potentially need to harm you more while you're in a state of crisis. That's not protecting or serving or doing any of those things. And I think when you think about it that way, and you think about your own job and not if you don't have a union, you're not in a union. For me, I always just hope that these stories will reach people that maybe don't know about getting involved in their town or their budget. And like I had to ask you because I would love to reach out to state level people and ask them to please pass laws about police unions, because as much as I support unions so much, I know I just watched in Greenfield, they brought the union member with them, and every single question was basically like that would be a liability and the town would have to pay money. So it's almost like it was like almost like we won't keep you safe, we won't be able to do our jobs, almost like threats, like low grade, but still like it was almost alarming to see the power that, and like so thank you for speaking on that. I think and I hope down the line that more and more people will want to have some of the money that's going towards, say, like someone dropping off a piece of paper for 15 minutes and then getting paid for 4 hours at like $100 an hour. That just isn't sustainable for communities, and libraries are getting closed so that police can make the kind of money they make. Libraries are being defunded in some towns and different places across the state. Even right now in East Hampton, they're trying.
Yeah, and I could go on a whole rant about how important
Yeah.
libraries are.
Me
Like,
too.
like I have spent a bunch of time at a library this year, like reading like microfilm and stuff, and like they do so many important services, and like they're just like to pay police like $250,000-$300,000 a year when like half of that money is from like directing traffic or like dropping off paperwork or just doing stuff like that. Like it's completely insane. Like we need to fund other services, and I think that like we're headed in this direction in this country where I think the powers that be are going to, in the next however many years, or over the next however many years, they're going to want to like kind of force austerity on everyone and say, oh, this like economic crunch caused by COVID and all this other stuff. Well, we're just going to have to take money away from normal people, everyday people, instead of, finding ways to like support people during these difficult times. And, we need to like rein in services, like we need to rein in institutions like the police and the courts and the jails and the prisons that are costing our society so much money and often not even providing services. They're just harming people, and we need to spend that money on uplifting people instead. And just so one other, to piggyback off your point about people getting involved in local towns, this like public records thing that I had to do to report this story, like I don't know, we probably can't get into the details too much, but like anyone can do that. They're called public records for a reason. Anyone can make a request to their town or city and ask for police records or payroll records or whatever. And I won't lie and pretend that like it's as simple as that, because typically what happens is they will fight you on it, and there's a whole appeals process that you can use, and it can be intimidating, but like don't be intimidated by it, because you will in fact get like interesting things and you will uncover important information if you do this. And even if they fight you and don't release the records, that's often interesting in and of itself. Like, why don't they want the public to see this police report, or why don't they want the public to watch this video? And are the reasons they're giving the real reasons, or is it because they're trying to cover up something embarrassing? And like, just to give one example, that video that I got from Shirley, I had to file 4 appeals to get that video. And the town's reasoning was, they claimed that the video had, so there's exemptions under the public records law, where certain information they can withhold to like protect people's personal privacy or medical information or things of that nature. Um, and they so that if they can redact information, like if you've ever seen one of those documents where there's like
Oh
black
yeah,
lines all over the
totally.
page, that's redacting. They can do that with videos too, like you can blur someone's face or you can cut the audio when they're talking about sensitive information, things like that. So their excuse was one thing they claimed was it was the Criminal Offender Records Information Law, the Corey statute, which protects information about people's criminal records. And they made this like absurd argument that, well, this guy was arrested, so it's Corey information and we don't have to give it to you, which is like, it's like an amazing thing to say, because you're saying almost every single person who the police use excessive force on is a person who's being arrested. And that means that if this were true, I mean, it's not, it's a bullshit reason. If this were true, then you could like never get a video of police using excessive force because it would always be related to someone being arrested, right? And in in fact, the state police like made the same argument when they wouldn't give me the video of the Egremont incident, which I got. Which is funny because I already had the video from the Berkshire County district attorney, but then here the state police are being like, well, we're super secretive and they might not have known that I had the video, but they're like, we don't want to give it to you, because it's shows someone being arrested. And we're never going to give you a video of someone being arrested, even when it shows excessive force by the police. But anyway, Shirley, they also claimed that it had like medical information and stuff.
Okay.
And so they were like, we bought video editing software specifically to edit this video. Like we paid money to buy software to edit the video.
Stop.
And after we bought it, we found out that it couldn't make the edits that we wanted to. So that's pretty interesting that they bought this software without like actually looking into what it does, and then messed around with it for no reason and found out that it didn't do the thing they wanted. I guess they didn't like talk to the person who sold it to them or whatever. And I kept appealing and I was like, this is completely ridiculous. Like there's like free software that, like on the internet that you can download that will edit the video. And I think I even told them, like, I just want the clip where they like kick the guy in the groin. Like I don't need to see like everything of him being booked by the police. And they actually finally they, after being told for like I think the third time that they couldn't like withhold the video, or it might have been the second time, I filed 4 appeals, but for like reasons they will get like closed for like procedural reasons. But they were told 2 or 3 times that they hadn't given a good enough reason to withhold the video. But finally, they are like, we partnered with an outside media group to edit the video, and they provided me like hours of video that show this guy like being booked, and like it's completely ridiculous. And like I didn't even need to see all this. Like they edited audio from parts of it, like where they're talking about the guy's home address and like medical stuff. And like literally I went in with free software that came with Windows on my computer and I clipped out the part that I wanted. And like that's all they had to do. And instead of like buying software and like fighting with me, and they actually had like a private law firm write a letter to me about how they weren't going to give me the video. And they did all this stuff, so they're paying lawyers, they're paying for software they don't need, and like all they had to do is go into Windows and like open this video up and like cut, I think it was like 50 seconds of video out of it and give that to me, and I would have stopped writing appeals, but like, they had to give me a hard time. And like but I don't want to dissuade people from making public records requests, because even though it's often difficult, it's rewarding. They gave me a hard time, but I did get this video, and now people can watch it and they can see what happened and they can understand like why this police officer had to resign from his job, and they can see like how inappropriate it was for another department to hire him. And I had this other video of this other incident, and people can see for themselves how all this stuff played out. And it's not because I'm like a journalist and have magical powers. It's because I did something that anyone can do. Like anybody can write these requests. It's as simple as writing an email to someone. You know, you look up their email online, you write an email, you say, hey, I want these records. I'm writing this under the public records law. And if they won't give them to you, you can write to the Secretary of State's office and complain and get a decision. And if they still won't give it to you, you can keep writing appeals and eventually you might get something. And like more people should do that because it, again, it's not like a superpower. It's just like something that anybody can do. And I may have more knowledge about it than most people because I've been doing it for so long. But like you shouldn't be intimidated by it. It's public records and they're public. And anyone who's a member of the public, you know, I believe the law says any person can request records. It doesn't matter if you like live in Russia or China, like you don't even have to live in Massachusetts or even in the country. You can write an email and get public records. Anyone can do this, and anyone can uncover, you know, misconduct by the police or by other government officials, and you know, and everyone should try. It's a really rewarding thing to try, I think.
I agree, Andrew. And I think I met you because I saw how much you were doing online, and I reached out because I do records requests, but it can be, I still think a little, sometimes it's just a little nerve-wracking because you don't know, or you might get a letter from a lawyer. So I would love, because we just talked a little bit about it, if you would come on again and we could do a whole episode where maybe we could make people feel a little more comfortable and go over, and we can share like other resources, because I know you shared with me like even the template for how to write to them and ask for things. And sometimes that's helpful, but I think I guess a question that ties back to the story about records would be, did you find it was much easier in some of the smaller towns than it is? Like you said, the state police won't talk to you, wouldn't give you things at all. Does it vary from town to town, just like the policies do, on whether or not they'll be more forthcoming or not forthcoming with the records?
It really varies. I think what it has to do with is the culture of the place that you're requesting the records from. Like you would think, for example, that Boston is like the wealthiest, largest place, municipality in our state, that they would be able to just throw money at this and give people all the records they want. In reality, they are just like, they're horrible, they're awful, like they're so difficult to get records from. In fact, I have this like funny story. There's a website called Muckrock, which I used to use to do some of my requests, and Muckrock is like, they'll do the records request like for you, like you have to write it, but they have these tools that like assist with you, and they have like clerks in their office who can process some of the information for you. But one of the tools they have is like an automatic follow-up email. So like every 2 weeks, it'll send an email being like, hey, you didn't give me these records. Can I follow up on it? And I like stopped using Muckrock a while ago, and I like had these requests I hadn't been like following up on, and they kind of like forgot about them. One of them was to the Boston Police Department, and I logged into Muckrock the other day, and the automatic email, it's been sending it to them for over like 6 years now. And they initially said, oh, we got your request like the day I sent it, we're processing it. And then for 3 years, it kept reminding them. And finally, literally, like, I think it was like 2 days shy of like the 3rd anniversary of my request, or a couple days shy, something like that. They were like, oh, we saw your request again, and we're going to do it this time, and we're processing it. And then the email has continued for another like 3+ years, and they just never gave me the records. And like, that's how Boston is. Like, you have to really be on their ass about it. And they give you such a hard time. And like, Springfield is awful. Worcester is like, we could do a whole episode about Worcester, how they like, they spent years making these bad faith arguments in court to withhold police misconduct records from the Telegram and Gazette newspaper. And there was like just another ruling about that recently. so like the three biggest municipalities in the state are just awful about public records, particularly things that relate to police misconduct. Um, and incidentally, or perhaps not incidentally, they also have huge problems with police misconduct. I mean, Worcester is currently under Department of Justice investigation. Springfield had an investigation like that
Yeah.
recently, and Boston had like the police union president who was like raping children, while he was a cop for 20 years, and various other problems. Um, and then like small towns, it varies. I mean, like the state
Yeah.
police, again, are a huge institution with lots of money. They can spend whatever money they want on tasers or overtime. They have so much overtime money that, people can steal it for years without anyone noticing, but they just like don't put any money into public records responses. And they will like ignore you if you don't continuously follow up with them, and they'll write responses that deny you records for like completely ridiculous reasons. Whereas, small towns will sometimes do that, like with Shirley, for example, but not always. I mean, it really varies. And I think to some extent it's about how persistent you are. Like a lot of these people, if they realize you're not going to stop bothering them, then they will eventually get tired of it and, acquiesce to your demands. But sometimes they won't. Like that's why
Right.
lawsuits sometimes happen. But like that's like a whole topic. I'd love to
Yeah,
come
we
on
can
again and we
totally,
can
I
get
would
into
love
that.
to. Yeah, totally. Because I think it's just something that people should know how to do. And thank you for your persistence and just the way that you say that we can all do it. Because it is actually something that I think probably makes others nervous, like myself. But you, like you said, you can find the most interesting things out. But I'm so grateful for your persistence and your investigative journalism, Andrew. Like just finding out about these things and bringing stories like this to light. It's just so important. So I just
Yep,
want to
thanks
put that
for
out
saying that.
there.
Thanks for saying that.
I know, I just know how much time it must be and how much time it must take to even be that persistent. So thank you.
This is going to be a good time to remind. We talked about how any citizen can, or anybody anywhere should be doing records requests, and we should be encouraging transparency in our government. We should be pushing to change laws, all the things we mentioned. But the only thing we haven't talked about was how to support journalists like yourself. We emphasize here in the Weed Out, the reason we want somebody like yourself on is because we want to platform other people that are doing work that everybody, it's going to take the whole village here. So like everybody's got to do their thing. And as much as it's good to encourage individuals to do stuff, but you can also, with more effectiveness, support, follow, share people that are more experts at doing these things like yourself. I don't know if you know how comfortable you are with being called an expert, but compared to us, you are an expert and on records requests and journalistic bona fides. You've been doing it longer than either of us, and we only kind of dabble in the journalism every now and then when we report with the shoestring. But I guess where can we find you? First of all, shout out all your like outlets and
Oh man, first of all, like you just got me thinking, like I have kind of a cynical thing to say, which is that like right now it's really hard to support local journalism because like I don't think this is like true in the Berkshires. I think they're owned by some different companies, but like a lot of papers in Massachusetts are owned by Gannett, which merged with Gatehouse, which previously owned a lot of papers. Like Gannett is the USA Today company, and they own like hundreds of newspapers. And like it's just like a meat grinder. Like they will buy up these papers and then they will just like lay people off, and they'll merge like papers from different towns into regional papers. And like it's so hard in some ways to tell people to support local journalism because it's like you can, yeah, sure, sign up for a subscription to your local paper, but it's not going to actually support journalism. Like they're just going
oh
to like
no,
lay off a bunch of
we're
people.
talking specifically yourself.
No, I know. I'm sorry. I just like you got me like on a little bit of a rant.
No,
But
we
but
That's
for
don't.
okay.
me, thankfully, I don't work for a Gannett newspaper. I'm an independent journalist. So if you want to support my work, you can give money directly to me. I have a Substack newsletter. It's called the Mass Dump. And you can sign up for subscription for free, which is great because you can read what I write, but even better would be if you sign up for a paid subscription, because there's like a small cut that goes to Substack, but the rest of it goes directly to me. And if you are the kind of person who doesn't like getting like emails, like you'd rather just like follow me on Twitter or like check my website every so often, you can send me money on PayPal. There's a link usually at the end of my stories or in the like about section. Um, and you can send money that way. And again, most of it goes directly to me. So be super appreciative if people do that, because it really is a lot of work to do this kind of thing, and like it means a lot to me when people like recognize that it's important and that they want to support it. And nobody can lay me off because they decided they wanted their like quarterly, reports to look better for their investors or whatever.
Or
Well,
you're not barking down up the wrong tree, and then your financiers who are funding your journalism, and you're going after something that they may have interest in keeping quiet. That's the nice way of putting it, I guess. Conflict of interest when you get more people involved. But so supporting local journalists, that's our
Yeah, and I guess one
share
important
here.
thing about supporting like this sort of like independent thing is like traditional media is all about so-called like objectivity, and there's like a lot of things you're not supposed to say because supposedly it's like an opinion, but like I don't really care about that. Like I think it's important to sort of tell people like, look, this is where I stand. I don't really like the police as an institution. I don't like prisons as an institution. I think there's like a lot of problems in our society. And like, you don't have to read between the lines. Like, I'll tell you that directly. Like, this is where I'm coming from. And I care so much about this work that like, this is why I do it. Like, I'm not just like I will report the facts to you, but I'm doing it because of these reasons.
and that's why we're going to share all of your information so everyone listening can follow. And at least if you can't give Andrew money, please give him support by sharing, liking, following him, subscribing to him. That alone helps get his name out there and get these stories to light, because as independent journalists, it's also you're your own marketing, you're doing all those things on your own. And I agree with you, Andrew. It's so hard to be objective about things like the police assaulting us, and it being okay, or just not saying that this is awful. I guess, I just wonder if there's anything you'd like to say, like to wrap up the story about the police brutality in the Berkshires, because we'll have to have you on again for records keeping for sure.
Wow. I mean, I felt like we pretty thoroughly talked about the story, I think. I guess just that like I guess what I would say is that like things like this probably they happen more than you might think, and like they don't always get reported in the media, not even because of like, you know, oh, the media doesn't want to report them or something, but like as I was saying, like you have all these reporters getting laid off, like it's like a slaughterhouse with journalism right now. Like local journalism is kind of dying, and like when that happens, what that means is um, that stories like this will go unreported. And that's why it's important to find ways to support local journalism, whether it's independent journalism or like, again, I hesitate to say that you should subscribe to your local newspaper, not because I don't support the journalists, but because of like the companies that are like destroying journalism. But find a way, even if it's just saying thank you to a reporter on Twitter because they like wrote an important story, like support local journalism and uh, tell people how important it is, and um, just find a way to support local journalism, and or else it's not a threat, it's just the reality, like where stories like this aren't going to be reported and they're important, and like it's just hard to think about what our country would be like without reporters uncovering information. And I'm not just saying that because I do this kind of work. Like you know, I'm saying it because it's the truth. Like we need people to expose the truth about, you know, these institutions of power that abuse people, that take away our freedom, that waste money and resources that could be spent on uplifting people. Um, and you know, knowing about that stuff is like the first part of the battle. So we need people to either do the work or to support the work.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank you for coming on, Andrew. We appreciate it, and I want to remind everybody, call to action to go check out Andrew's article regarding this situation out in the Berkshires. It's called "She Knocked." What was the byline, Andrew?
It's called "She Just Knocked Herself Out," which is a quote from one of the police officers, and then a tale of alleged police brutality in Berkshire County.
So yeah, we're gonna post that on our episode website, but we'll also if you go to Andrew's Substack Mass Dump and subscribe there, you can see the article there. We recommend giving it a read so you can get a little more context on what this episode was about.
And you can watch the video as well.
There's also other media there as well. So we're going to get this out in podcast form, probably do some other social media stuff with it. There's a lot of issues in quote unquote progressive Massachusetts. You know, we tout that, but you know, you have the Sandra Birchmore issue in Eastern Mass, and you know, her murder, I should say, and cover up by the police, and then this issue that you covered so diligently in Egremont. There's a lot to uncover, so everybody please check Andrew's work out. We appreciate everybody listening, and thank you, Andrew, for coming on. And
yeah, it's been awesome, and we'll definitely do another one.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. And Joanna, I'll let you say goodbye to everybody.
Oh, everyone take care, be well, and support your local independent journalists. And if please start with our friend Andrew, because he is doing the work out there. So just be well.